the IMF is deeply concerned about the ability of sub-Saharan African economies to cope with the surge in the prices of the three F's: food, fertilizer and fuel. Now, all of that, of course, has been triggered by Russia's military operation in Ukraine. The fund slashed its growth outlook for the region to 3.8%, down from earlier estimates of 4.5% growth for 2022. Now, the IMF is expecting growth to average 4% over the next 3 years or so, but it's warning that, quote, it will be too slow to make up for the ground lost during the pandemic. Now, at the same time, inflation is forecast to remain eye-wateringly high, averaging 12.2% this year and 9.6% in 2023. This, according to the fund, is the first time since 2008 that inflation has been at such high levels. But what's different this time is that even though food and fuel prices were also elevated back in 2008, right now, countries' fiscal buffers have been depleted by the pandemic. Roughly 60% of low-income economies are at high risk of debt distress. And remember, food spending takes up an average of 40% of incomes in the region, and that makes price changes extremely sensitive. With inflation as high as it is, governments may find it unpalatable to remove food and fuel subsidies, even though they cannot afford them. Now, earlier on, I spoke to the head of the IMF's Africa Department, Abebe Selassie. We started our conversation by examining just how hard African economies might be by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The main channel through which we expect Russia's invasion of Ukraine to impact the countries is the terms of trade or commodity price channel. This is not to trivialize it. In fact, if it's a very, very serious shock to the region, particularly because it will be impacting food and fuel prices. So if the conflict is going to be sustained for a longer period, what that will mean is that, likely elevated food and fuel prices for a long while still. This will have very, very direct effect on our people. First and foremost, it will cause inflation, particularly food price inflation, to go up markedly. And this, of course, is in a region which is already food insecure, where a significant share of income already is devoted to food, means that some of the consequential effects of this crisis will be felt by our people.
How should countries approach this inflation dilemma? Because I know in the report you spent a fair bit of time dealing with it, but looking at inflation, for example, in economies that are net oil importers, like Kenya, for example, or even in places like Nigeria, where inflation has been relatively high for quite a while, it's not driven by a certain amount of money circulating within the economy, right? It's because of supply side issues. Either food's not coming in at the right time, or it's coming in at a really, really high price. And traditional tools for dealing with inflation, like raising rates for central banks, simply can't respond to that sort of problem.
Yes, I mean, central bankers in particular are at a very, very, in a very invidious position. Even before this latest inflationary pressure coming from food, but also fuel prices, which have this effect of cascading through our economies. Even before this latest shock, our countries hadn't fully recovered to the pre-pandemic growth trajectory as many other advanced and some EM economies had. And yet, it was very clear that advanced countries were going to be tightening, were heading towards a tightening cycle. So even before this latest pressure, our central bankers were trying to do a delicate balancing act between continuing to support the recovery, not withdraw liquidity as rapidly, while keeping a wary eye on what advanced country central banks were going to do. Now you have this big shock, which is going to increase inflationary pressures. So that challenge is going to be even more difficult to balance. What we are saying for central banks to consider is, some of the first round effects of the shock that we've seen is, I think, unavoidable to see it pass through. But it's going to be important to be very watchful to make sure that this process doesn't embed itself, and reacting if it looks likely that we're going to be seeing this inflationary process embedding itself.
When you speak to authorities in Nigeria and in Kenya, Nigeria, of course, has had its fuel subsidy program running for a lot longer. Kenya introduced it fairly recently. What sort of defense do you get from these authorities for their policy of keeping these fuel subsidies in place, even though, strictly speaking, they don't have the fiscal room for it, one, and two, I mean, the economics on this are pretty settled, as you pointed out. The subsidies tend to be regressive. They're benefiting people who really do not need them.
So, our task really in conversations with policymakers is to discuss the trade-offs that countries are facing and to think about ways in which, the various objectives countries have can best be at finding alternatives on how those could be addressed. So as you point out, like in a context like Nigeria, for example, what we do really is show kind of, the alternative, the cost of the fuel subsidies, for example, and as you said, it really is very significant. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's of course up to the government of Nigeria to do what they feel is appropriate. So, our task is really just to show the trade-offs. And as you said, of course, some poor people will also benefit some from keeping fuel subsidies in place, but the lion's share of the benefit will be accruing to wealthier households. So finding ways in which you can target support. Cash transfers is a good example. In the context of the pandemic, we saw countries like Togo very, very quickly, very nimbly rolling out targeted ways in which to help the poorest and most vulnerable households. So there are things that can be done to target support and use resources to address many of the development objectives, the development needs our countries have in infrastructure, in addressing, of course, the much those pressures that we face to improve health and education outcomes. So those are the kind of trade-offs that policymakers need to consider.